Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom on the programme as Ukraine and Russia go through their latest round of talks and as reports come in of Moscow having approached China for help, something that Beijing is denied. What we are trying to do is a deep dive of the on-ground situation. On the show, some of the world's foremost experts looking at just what Russia has actually managed to achieve as we enter day 20 of the war that's coming up. How serious is Russia's logistics nightmare? In other words, its ability to fuel and arm the thousands of military vehicles and tens of thousands of soldiers that it's deployed. And the biggest question, does Kyiv realistically have a chance, despite being able to step up to the plate so far with a robust defense against the Russian juggernaut? So let's take a look now at what the ground situation actually is in Ukraine. So let's bring up the first map, and what we're actually trying to do at this stage is take a look at, well, this is where it's all happening now. This was the situation before the invasion actually began. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, of course, that is in the Donbas region, which was where this was all triggered from. Areas further to the south. So let's take a look at what happened when the Russian invasion began on the 23rd, 24th of last month. These were the initial routes that the Russians had actually taken. These were all the areas that they were looking into. Remember, the Russian strategy was always get in and get to the cities as fast as possible. Now, as we approach day 20, they've not been able to do that. Let's move to the next page, which gives you an idea of where the Russians were on the 4th of March. Now, again, they've extended their forward lines. They have captured a great deal more territory. But in terms of the big cities, again, Kyiv, Kharkiv, even cities further south on the 4th of March, for example, Mariupol or Odessa, they didn't capture the cities then either. And let's move to the next page. The next page shows the situation on the 7th of March. The areas which we've circled, and let's have that up full frame, are areas where there have been small changes which have actually taken place. Small changes between what was there from the 4th of March to the 7th of March on the actual ground position line. Let's go to the next image, and this actually shows you the scene on the 12th of March. Again, we've circled the areas where there have been further advances by the Russians. This is in fact the last page we have, and I can tell you that we've got a couple of updates on the 13th of March, but the changes on the ground in the key Kyiv region have not been very significant at all. They've been actually quite small, but in other areas, for example, in western parts of Ukraine, there have been strikes, but that doesn't control the actual position on the ground. So, in as much as there is devastation in the cities because of fairly indiscriminate Russian shelling, particularly in the south of the country, parts of the north of the country, villages north of Kyiv, they've not actually been able to expand their footprint a very great deal. Now, one of the points that we've not really looked at thus far, some of the key weapons deployed on the Ukraine front by Russia and by Ukraine. So let's take a look first at this. Now, this is what has been causing a great deal of havoc to air bases and to other strategic targets. This is the Iskander ballistic missile. It has a range of up to 500 kilometers. That's one of the weapons that Russia has been using. Let's go to the next point. This is a 3M14 caliber land attack cruise missile. It's deployed on ships by and large. It has a range of up to 2,500 kilometers. And again, it's this missile which was perhaps used extensively in the missile attacks which took place in the Lviv area of western Ukraine. The next weapon that you see over here is the TOS-1 Buratino. It's a heavy flamethrower. It has a range of up to 6 kilometers, particularly devastating. It results in huge fires, unguided rockets with thermobaric warheads. It's questionable whether it should be used at all in a war context, but it has been used, it is believed, in some areas. The T-90 main battle tank, that is the front line of what the Russians have deployed so far in Ukraine, and also the T-72 BM-3 battle tank, which is an uprated version. These have been taking massive hits from Ukraine. For example, and let's bring up the Ukrainian weapons, what you actually see is the Bayraktar TB2 drone. It's been operational now for a couple of years. It's airborne for up to 27 hours. These have been picking off the Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers. It's a huge, huge problem. The Ukrainians have also deployed the Javelin anti-tank guided missile. It has a range of up to 4 kilometers, again, knocking out Russian logistics, knocking out Russian armor, which is why on day 20, the main cities have still not been captured, by and large, by the Russians. There's also the next generation light anti-tank weapon that you see there. It's called onslaught. It has a range of up to 800 meters. Again, it hits armor. By and large, it's been incredibly effective in what we've seen. But this is something which would really worry Russia, certainly, that as we approach day 20, they still don't have complete dominance of the air. They don't have air superiority over Ukrainian airspace. It's challenged. It's deeply contested. That's one of the weapon systems that contests it. The Stinger surface-to-air missile with a range of 8 kilometers, that's been instrumental in taking out any number of helicopters, for example. Shashank Joshi, the defense editor of The Economist, joins me now. Shashank, thanks very much for being with us.
You're very welcome.
Is there very substantial ground progress by Russian soldiers 20 odd days into the war? Is this where they expect it to be?
The short answer is yes, there is substantial ground progress. They have taken over quite substantial swaths of the south of the country. They've surrounded Mariupol and besieged it. They have occupied Kherson, although they faced, as you may have seen, substantial opposition from Ukrainian residents. They have also pushed out from the Donbass region in the east, and Russian forces are on the west and east of Kyiv, including within 25 kilometers of the city center, within rocket artillery range. So, yes, they have made progress, but I would say two things, Vishnu. First of all, that progress has come at extraordinary cost. We have probably seen the highest rate of Russian casualties in a war since the Second World War, more than in the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. So the question number one is it sustainable? Mm-hmm. And question number two is that the advances that we have seen so far do not necessarily tell us about the ease of advances that may come in the following weeks. Mm-hmm. Because as you know very well, and I'm sure viewers know very well, urban warfare, the task of surrounding, besieging, and seizing a large city the size of Kyiv, is a profoundly difficult and costly task. And it is by no means clear to me from what I have seen and from some of the things that you have been describing just now, that Russian forces who are, have taken losses, are somewhat demoralized, maybe suffering from high equipment losses, that they're up to the task of seizing a city like Kyiv. That isn't obvious at this stage, I would say.
Shashank, as we look at the ground situation now, are we gradually seeing a shift from where we were, say, 3 days back or 4 days back, when there was an actual sense that Ukrainian forces were going to push back the Russians or inflict such losses which would be untenable for Russia to sustain, to now, perhaps Russia gaining the upper hand partially because of the indiscriminate shelling that we are seeing in so many cities?
I think it's too early to draw any firm conclusions on that. I still have seen successful Ukrainian counterattacks, particularly around Kyiv, and they have held those Russian forces at bay outside of the city. Russia has made progress, but it's behind where it wanted to be. It doesn't mean Ukraine is going to be able to push back the Russians all the way back to Belarus or mount very substantial counterattacks. But nor does it mean that Russia's offensive is sustainable. In military terms, officers and military professionals talk about the culminating point of an offensive. And that's the point at which an offensive runs out of steam. That is, you suffer casualties, your equipment breaks down, morale is low, you're exhausted. And it doesn't mean Russia is defeated. It means Russia has to pause, regroup, move on to the defensive while it resupplies its forces, which is apparently proving to be a substantial problem, as you outlined at the beginning, and then recommence its offensive. We will only know whether the Russian army is capable of that in the coming weeks. It's too early to say. And I would say that even if Russian forces prove to be exhausted in the coming weeks, it doesn't mean this is great news for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that Vladimir Putin is going to march his army straight back home. It could just as well, in my opinion, presage an escalation. And I still think we should be aware of the possibility of the chemical weapons being used in Ukraine. And that would be the first time chemical weapons have been used on a European battlefield in over 100 years.
Why do you suggest, and obviously it's been suggested elsewhere as well, that chemical weapons could in fact be used? Is it because Russia, in the next couple of weeks, you believe, would not be or potentially not be able to make the progress that it would like because the defenses of the key cities remain fairly robust, and therefore, out of desperation, Putin may resort to this?
I think that's probably right. It would have two purposes. It would firstly assist in depopulating urban areas in the way that we saw the Assad regime use these chemical weapons in northwest Syria in the last 5 or 6 years. And it would also justify Russia's involvement in Ukraine, because, of course, Russia has been making completely spurious claims about American-funded biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. And if there was a chemical weapons attack, I would suspect that it would be immediately blamed by Russia on Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And that would justify Russia's reason for being in the country in the first place. So, that's how broadly I would look at those risks. It doesn't mean it is certain to happen, but I think that the red flags that we are seeing, European officials raising the alarm, Russia talking about chemical weapons itself, the slow progress they've been making, all point in that direction. And I would say, look at Mariupol, look at the city of Mariupol, which is in terrible shape. The shelling it's taken, the rockets it's taken. That is a city that is considerably smaller than Kyiv, considerably smaller. And it has held out for over 2 weeks. So how long and difficult would a battle for Kyiv be?
No, in fact, Shashank, that's why I asked you that first question of mine. Have the Russians really made progress? In terms of progress, yes, they may have gained kilometers, but they're not actually holding the territory, and they aren't holding many of the key cities. And I would suggest that if you don't hold the cities, then you don't really exude power, out into the countryside in terms of holding areas. And in fact, Shashank, that brings me to my next question, which is this. Even if Russia militarily defeats the Ukraine, even if Russia militarily gets into the key cities, including Kyiv, how does it actually hold those cities? Because the resistance isn't going to go away. That's absolutely clear. The Ukrainians aren't. So in a sense, has Russia not already lost? How are you going to physically maintain those areas? Where are the numbers? Who is going to do that?
I think that's exactly the right question to ask. And I suspect that Russian forces in Kherson or in Mariupol or in these other places are going to fare about as well as British forces did in Basra, which is to say not terribly well at all. Their presence is unwanted and they will face substantial resistance. If you look at the videos coming out of Kherson, I have been astonished to see the level of open resistance, defiance and contempt directed at Russian forces, who are heavily armed, unarmed civilians going up to Russian forces and insulting them and opposing them. Now, the protesters of today are the partisans of tomorrow. Right. And what today is a march or a demonstration is tomorrow going to be an ambush, an IED, or a sniper attack on a Russian officer. And let me tell you, that's going to be incredibly ugly. I think what we're going to see is Russian intelligence and the Russian armed forces engage in reprisals against civilian areas, directed attacks on civilian leadership in Ukraine. And indeed, we've already seen a public official in Kherson taken away with a bag over his head by the Russians because he refused to collaborate. That's the situation they're going to be driven into, I think.
No, absolutely. I was in Western Ukraine till a few days back in the Lviv area. I had grandmothers come up to me and tell me that they're going to fight with Molotov cocktails. They've got them all lined up in their homes, ready to fight. It's unfathomable. Thanks so much for joining us, Shashank. Thanks very much indeed. We're also joined now by Simtak, the military analyst at Force Analysis, Jack Detch, national security reporter at Foreign Policy. Salomia Bobrovska is an MP from Ukraine, and Glenn Carl has been a career CIA expert and officer, and former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for transnational threats there. Thank you all very much for being with us. Jack, let me come to you first. Russia and its logistics have been a nightmare. How has that changed, if at all, in the last 3 days or 4 days?
Well, I think, Vishnu, the Pentagon is still seeing some tactical shifts from the Russians. That 40-mile convoy that was bunched up to the north of Kyiv has now dispersed into urban areas and into tree lines. So the Russians are just basically trying to take cover, to live off the land to a degree, and basically not extend their logistical lines to the north, which has been a major problem. In the south, they've had a much easier time of it. The logistical lines from Crimea to Kherson, which they've taken, for instance, are much shorter, but that may be more difficult as they're trying to encircle Odessa in the coming weeks. If they do attempt an amphibious landing, as British and American officials do expect, it would just be very difficult to supply that force going further to the west, and perhaps if they try to make an encircling move on Kyiv, even further up to the north.
Sim, what is the situation in Kyiv presently?
So right now, Kyiv, of course, has been under bombardment by artillery and by missile strikes. But on the ground, things are actually somewhat stable. To the western side of Kyiv, the Ukrainian military has been able to hold the Russian offensive behind the Irpin River, which is a river that runs north to south, kind of along Kyiv's flank. And on the other side, Russian forces have been trying to come closer to the capital, but each time they've tried so far, they have actually suffered significant losses in those offensives.
Glenn, Carl, similar question to what I was asking Shashank Joshi a few minutes back. Even if Putin physically wrests control of Kyiv or some of the other big cities away from the Ukrainians, how is this, in a sense, almost a war that he's lost? Even if he gains territory, how is he going to physically hold those areas? Where are the numbers?
Well, the numbers don't seem to be there. The rule of thumb for an attack historically to succeed is you want 3 times the forces of those who are defending. They don't have that. They're roughly at parity in the size of the forces. Their tactics and training seem to be notably inferior to those of the Ukrainians and of NATO. The consistent refrain from the private soldiers that you hear speaking while in combat up to the more senior commanders and the intelligence analysts from the Western countries is the shocking low quality of the tactical units. However, they are brutal and they have a lot of remarkable equipment. And so for all of the heroism of the Ukrainians, I am quite apprehensive that simply mass will in the end tell. But how to hold it, there's another equation. You need the estimate of the American experts and military experts in Iraq was that we needed over 600,000 soldiers, as I recall, to control the country minimally. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have that. And Ukraine is substantially more armed, better trained, more mobilized, and larger. So the answer to your question seems to be there doesn't appear a happy way forward for the Russians. I think they can succeed in destroying cities, certainly, ultimately wearing down Ukrainians, absent a NATO involvement. But then you have what we have just heard, and what you have experienced firsthand, an utterly motivated and a population that will resist. Yeah. So I don't see a happy way forward, but we do have, tragically, many examples in history of occupying forces that are ruthless and can oppress people that are sullen and resist.
Yep. Salomia Bobrovska, how optimistic are you on the talks now taking place?
I cannot be optimistic at all for this 19 days of the war, especially when I'm getting messages from Mariupol. Just all day could be the last day for the whole town, for all my friends who are serving in military armed forces or state bodyguard forces. And what I have news from there, that means they will destroy this town totally up to the end, until the armed forces will give up, or our Ukrainian delegation will say, okay, leave it alone, and we will move back from Mariupol. So each night we are not going to bed. We're waiting for the news and waiting for the new targets, on which Russian Federation is trying to attack. And today in the morning, they attacked the western part of Ukraine. The TV tower is maybe 150 kilometers away from Polish border. Yesterday, they attacked the peacekeeping operation center in very western part of Ukraine, in Lviv region, and that means they're trying to refocus the attention not on, from Kyiv, from Mariupol, from the very south, from north to the west, just to show there is nowhere is the peaceful and place for civilians and for military forces as well.
Jack, when does it become untenable for any military force to continue fighting on the basis of the losses they've incurred and of the losses to equipment? What is the percentage calculation when one says that Russia on the ground in Ukraine is no longer an effective military force?
So you mean about the Ukrainian specific ballpark, but when we're looking at basically what we've been talking about over the course of the program, this potentially morphing into the Russians face to fight a counterinsurgency where they either provide some governing forces and the Ukrainians resist them. It's difficult to imagine the Russians putting up the mass for that, because you talk about a 5-to-1 advantage on the defensive versus the offensive, and the Russians are already throwing conscript troops at a much more experienced Ukrainian army than they saw in 2014. Now, if they encounter an urban resistance that we are expecting, should they actually try and take the cities and not just cut them off and seek out a diplomatic solution here, they could fight against much more inferior forces, militarily experienced speaking, but they would just be running up against a brick wall in terms of these narrow streets of Kyiv, trying to fight down block by block, and just getting pummeled with things like Molotov cocktails and running into obstacles all over the place. So it's difficult to imagine Russia really putting up the mass to do that. I think one of the mysteries here for the Pentagon has just been the lack of Russian air power coming to the battlefield. Just that we've only seen 200 Russian sorties per day, many of them standoff cruise missile strikes from over the border, either in Russia and Belarus. So there's a question now of whether, as the Ukrainian air superiority continues to be degraded, if the Russians are then going to try to mount a much more serious offensive from the air.
Sim, do you think that we're in the midst of a tactical pause in the Kiev region? We've seen the images of that enormous logistical chain and their armor 40-odd kilometers north of Kiev itself, not really moving. Maybe they've dispersed somewhat. But they've had a logistical nightmare. Are we in the middle of a strategic pause, a tactical pause? Because let's face it, in Kiev itself, in the last 48 hours, there's not been much in terms of military movement.
No, and I think some of that has been related to the logistical problems that we've talked about Russia facing. But we also need to be realistic. This is a really heavy fight along, at this point, very defended positions. Just earlier last week, Russia tried to cross the Irpin River, for example, but conducting one of those river crossing operations, setting up pontoon bridges and establishing a foothold on the other side, that's very complex. And in this case, Russia got caught during the operation, received a lot of artillery on its end. And that's how Ukraine is essentially wearing down that Russian offensive force. And even without all of the logistical issues, I think this is still a very, very significant challenge for Russia to actually overcome.
Glenn Carl, final question to you. What is the way out from here? I mean, do you realistically see Putin backing down or compromising somewhat, Zelensky compromising somewhat? Is there still an opportunity for peace?
Well, one hopes there is. I don't see a way forward. I have thought a lot since all this began about a Soviet operation from decades ago called Operation Ryan. This was in the 1980s, and the Russian leadership feared that President Reagan would launch a first strike of nuclear forces to destroy the Soviet Union. There wasn't the smidgen of truth to any of this. However, the orders went out to the intelligence services of the Soviet Union, and if you look for something, you will find it. So they confirmed their suppositions made out of whole cloth, and yet they sincerely believed it. And why this is relevant is because I have never found the Russian leaders, tragically in my experience, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, to have been reconstructed really at all. They remain quite similar, and so I think they're sincere in their delusions, which means that Putin is unlikely to change how he acts. And there's no way forward successfully, really, that we're seeing for him. And I don't see him backing out. So I am pessimistic. The glimmer of hope is that the Chinese have clearly floated indications that they could play a mediating role, and possibly there would be a way forward that way. Zelensky is a very, all of us have been impressed. Of course, the man has met the moment and is heroic and rational and is acting quite sensibly. Now, what that would mean practically, nobody knows. So I'm not hopeful.
Right. I think that Chinese angle is interesting, isn't it? Would the United States be okay with that in the long run? I think that's another thread which perhaps we'll have to look at later on. But I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. We'll just leave you with an image of Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, who's tweeted out a video of the destruction that Russia has caused on the capital of Ukraine. Putin's dream of creating a greater Russia is my country's nightmare, is what he said.
That's what Russians' war against the civilians look like. Destroyed buildings, destroyed infrastructure. City bus just got hit by the rocket. Lives are getting lost. That's the war that Russia started. That's the city of Kyiv. And many cities in Ukraine were destroyed. Lives were taken. That's the truth. These images is the truth of Russian war against Ukraine. Putin's war against Ukraine. That's what it looks like.
Utter devastation over there. A large modern city, parts of which are now rubble. It's so tragic what's happening in Ukraine. Lots of comments coming in on coup. What will India's stand now be on Russia, as China is supporting Russia? That's a key question that's been asked by Deepak Kumar Sharma. Also another comment, the Russian ruble is plunging with imposed sanctions, already creating monetary losses. Will China try to keep its image personified in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Will banking on China lead to Russian offshore buying dollar reserves? Well, those are a couple of comments which have actually come in. Out of time, more coming up. Stay tuned.